NAFTA, a total disaster.
He will find some excuse to turn on Canada.
There is one of two things, Mr. Prime Minister. You are either a liar or you're confused.
We need to start reducing our greenhouse gas emissions, but we also have to, thank you.
All right, beyond the immigration ban, there's more upheaval caused by the new administration. Donald Trump's war of words with Mexico is being followed extremely closely in Canada. And if his talk on trade is true, and there's no reason to believe it isn't, the fate of the North American Free Trade Agreement as we know it is very much up in the air. Should Canada stand by Mexico or mind its own business for now? Susan.
Well, in a funny way, if NAFTA's up in the air, that could be good for us. No, it will not have escaped anybody's notice that 650 jobs were lost in Ingersoll, Ontario this week at a GM plant transferred down to Mexico. To some extent, southwestern Ontario shares the same problems that the Rust Belt in the U.S. does. That, in other words, Trump's constituency probably extends above the border. Another interesting thing, Jerry Diaz, the head of Unifor, the big auto worker union, if I'm not misquoting him, I don't think I am, said this weekend that moving more automobile construction north, like to Michigan and the border states, is actually good for Canada because, the whole industry is so integrated. We supply a lot of the parts to those factories in Michigan and elsewhere in the States. So it's a strange kind of alliance of the Canadian union movement with Donald Trump's views on NAFTA, and it's certainly when it comes to automobile manufacturing.
All right, John?
That's why I always feel like I need to take a shower after talking about these subjects. Look,
why is that?
Because what is happening to Mexico is tragic. We signed a treaty, the North American Free Trade Agreement. It used to be that treaties were followed, they were honored. And now again, we have a president who comes in and says, I'm ripping it up, I don't care. I'm imposing a 20% tax on the border. And you guys can take me to the WTO, the World Trade Organization, if you want to, but it's going to be years before you get there. And in the meantime, I'm going to blackmail BMW and American automobile makers into moving north of the border. And Canada should stand with Mexico. Canada should say, no, this is a treaty. You can't just flout that treaty. Again, it's rule of law. The United States has always followed the rule of law, but we're not going to do it. We have to defend Canadian jobs. We have to defend Canadian industry. And it is perfectly clear that the federal government will and probably should abandon Mexico, betray it really, to be honest, in order to get the best deal it can with this man in Washington.
Well, John, can I just say, Ronna Ambrose is your gal, if that's what you believe. Ronna Ambrose was questioned about this Ingersoll plant shrinking this week. Her response was, that wasn't the fault of NAFTA. That was because we're not competitive. And she mentioned wages and the cost of energy in Canada. In other words, she is a checkered flag on the race to the bottom. Basically, she's saying our auto workers are being paid too much, so maybe they should go down to like $30 a day or whatever the Mexicans are paid. To me, that was very, that was putting ideology ahead of people's lives.
Or maybe the Ontario government should have doubled energy costs in the course of the last decade, putting so many businesses at risk.
Yeah, you can argue all that kind of stuff, but I mean, anyway.
Let me play what Barrio Gomez, who's a former Mexican congressman, had to say about this on Power and Politics earlier this week. Take a listen.
It's just a matter of time that he will find some excuse to turn on Canada. This is the time for Prime Minister Justin Trudeau to take a principled stand. I do not think that he needs to be confrontational, but I think he needs to be very clear what Canadian values are and how they align with Mexican values and how we are all three a part of North America. This is a threat to peace and prosperity in North America, just so we understand.
Susan, what do you think?
I think that much as ideological consistency is to be admired, and I guess I've never been totally sold on the gospel of free trade helping everybody anyway, not that I'm anti-trade, but I think the responsibility of any Canadian government is to protect Canadian jobs. And if the American president is in a protectionist mood, you want to get under that umbrella. You don't want to start, standing up to him and throwing in your lot with Mexico.
I think the one sort of caveat that I would add there is we have no reason to think that at this current point that it's some sort of scale, like if Donald Trump is particularly, angry and dismissive of the Mexican concerns, that somehow that's going to boost Canada. It may well turn out to be a zero-sum game and that both Canada and Mexico will suffer. So I think, in a sense, I appreciate what Mr. Gomez is saying. I think that Canada and Mexico should probably have a few chats amongst themselves to figure out how they're going to preserve that bilateral trading relationship as much as possible, given, what's going on, the chaos in the middle of the continent. So I think that there is a way for Canada to kind of proceed further and, again, not antagonize necessarily Donald Trump and the United States, but at the same time, let's see how this plays out because, not to go back to the whole, Muslim ban chaos, but it's becoming pretty clear that this administration doesn't always think things through and changes may happen and there may be unintended consequences. So I'm not sure we should absolutely be first in line to sign on to whatever it is, a blank deal that Donald Trump will then fill in the details of. I think we got to kind of keep our interests in mind here and see how this plays out.
Okay. I want to ask you about, because this is where our interests have aligned this past week, and that is Donald Trump coming out in favor of the Keystone XL pipeline, given some negotiation perhaps on this deal. But Prime Minister Justin Trudeau got an earful on his town hall ride this past week. Here's some of what was said. Let's listen to this one person who is very antagonistic, in particular, about Justin Trudeau's position on the oil sands and what he has said in the past about them being phased out. Take a listen.
Down east, you've been telling people that you want to kill the single biggest employer in our province. You're in Alberta right now, sir. You're not in Ottawa. Yet when you come to Calgary, you tell people you're sorry. Well, I'm sorry. I'm a little confused. There is one of two things, Mr. Prime Minister. You're either a liar or you're confused. And I'm beginning to think it's both.
Katie, let's start with you. What's your reaction to that particular exchange and overall the government's position of the environment versus the economy?
Yeah, you know what? This is one of those issues on which you are absolutely going to make people on either side of the issue really, really angry if you don't sort of side entirely with one or entirely with the other. At those very same town halls, you had, in other parts of the country, and actually in the West as well, you had the Prime Minister coming under fire from anti-pipeline activists who were absolutely horrified that he wasn't going to stop Keystone and other pipelines from happening. So, yeah, it is one of those issues on which there is always going to be someone angrily yelling at you. You just kind of got to work around it and figure out a path forward that is going to appeal to the majority of people. I think the whole issue of, the comment on phasing out the oil sands, I was so perplexed at the initial sort of frenzy of, oh my gosh, did he really say that? Because, of course, that is the long-term plan to deal with climate change, is eventually weaning the entire planet off of fossil fuels. That's not to say it's necessarily going to happen, but that's always been kind of the goal. The idea that it's unacceptable to voice that somehow you're turning on Alberta, I have to say, I just find that a bizarre approach. Again, that doesn't mean there aren't other mitigating factors that have to be considered, and it is possibly entirely a pipe dream and we'll never get off of fossil fuels. But the idea that, yeah, someday in the distance, wouldn't that be awesome? That's a pretty standard element of most climate change plans.
Okay. Is there a dissenting opinion on this?
Well, I totally agree with what Katie just said. And in fact, the angry man in Alberta, the angry man in Alberta represents, one angry man in Alberta and a cadre of others with the historic grievances against the Liberals and against Ottawa. But that may not even be a majority opinion in Alberta anymore. I think that opinion is afforded way too much respect and weight, as opposed to the other opinion, which is the more pro-environmental opinion, which has been buried. There's been virtually no pushback. No significant pushback on the fact that the Keystone is now added to the mix. So we now have 3 oil pipelines approved. Mm-hmm. If they're ever built, and I do tend to agree with John that it's going to be the market that decides this, not governments, but if they're ever built, that totally blows our Paris agreements out of the water. Mr. Trudeau said, as the remark about phasing out the pipelines that Katie was talking about, he in Calgary said, oh, I misspoke. Of course, we're always going to have the oil sands. And then he talked about the phase out taking 100 years. We're all going to be fried to a crisp by then. You know, has nobody noticed the ice storm in New Brunswick? Are there not enough people in New Brunswick for anybody to notice? You know, I know these. You can make facile comparisons between extreme weather events and climate change. Yak, yak, yak. I know all that. There are warning signs all over the place, and all of our political leaders, all the major parties are, you know, like that.
John?
Allow me to offer a dissenting opinion.
All right.
Jean Chrétien and Paul Martin and Stephen Harper, though their rhetoric changed between one administration and the other, all agreed on the same thing. If you have to choose between combating climate change and growing the economy, especially the oil and gas sector, you grow the oil and gas sector and you abandon your plans for climate change. Jean Chrétien did it, Paul Martin did it, and Stephen Harper did it. Justin Trudeau came in and said, it's not either or. You can, in fact, grow the oil and gas sector. You can expand the oil sands. You can build pipelines. But there are also ways in which you can do all of that and still combat global warming. No, you can't. And the problem that he has is that he's trying to do two things at the same time, to reconcile them one to the other. Eventually, you have to make a choice. And if you don't make that choice, the hypocrisy of it becomes apparent.